I'd like to say welcome to everyone and thank you for your support. My name is Erin, and I will be defending my thesis, Teaching Digital Ethos, Emphasizing the Rhetorical Impact of Hypertextuality and Intertextuality in the Digital Environment. The exigence for this project came about from a number of experiences I had while teaching as a graduate teaching assistant in a first-year composition classroom. The first of these was in March of last year on Facebook. One of the trending topics was the CONY 2012 video, which was very popular, targeted at college students. The video was produced by a charitable organization called Invisible Children. And the goal of the video was to raise funds to capture Joseph Kony, who was a Ugandan guerrilla war leader, who's also been accused of such crimes as enslaving child soldiers. So the purpose of the video was also to raise those funds, and particularly from college students. So I raised the issue in class, hoping that the students had seen the video and that we could have a good discussion about it. What I discovered was that some students had already donated money to Invisible Children, and they had done so without doing any additional research. And they had also done so without clicking on any of the other links that were associated with the video, other articles. That bothered me, partially because, not only because of the lack of research, but also because they had failed to make connections between those links and between the video. Another incident that I had had in class was assignments where students were asked to analyze a document and also didn't click on the links. And that also told me that they were failing to make those connections, and I wanted to do something about that. Later on, connected to the CONY 2012 video, 10 days after the video was released, one of the founders of Invisible Children had a very public meltdown. And what that meant was that now these photos and this information was connected on the internet through hyperlinks to the CONY 2012 video and to Invisible Children. And that made me wonder what the connection was, what these relationships did to the ethos of Invisible Children and CONY 2012. And that is where my research questions came from, which was, how do we teach students to recognize the relationships among texts connected by hyperlinks and the impact that those relationships have on digital ethos? So the thesis project then was to conceptualize a method for teaching that would allow students to visualize those elements. Current conversations in rhetoric and pedagogy, or rhetoric and composition pedagogy, are currently discussing these issues about how to adapt traditional techniques, simplified classical Greek rhetorical concepts, and apply them to new and emerging digital technologies. And what we've tended to do is not necessarily do that very well. Barbara Warnick argues that digital ethos is an illustrative example of this as we struggle to address the ways that credibility is constructed in digital environments. Current research and textbooks currently focus on ethos in terms of one text and one author, an isolated text and a single author, which does not demonstrate the context of the digital environment, and which I think is very important in this discussion. So that is what is missing, is the contextual nature of digital ethos, and then the ways that that is created by hyperlinked structure and intertextual relationships between those texts. So as such, I argue in this thesis for a heuristic that will emphasize those elements, that will emphasize the relationships that hypertextual links create between documents, as well as the intertextual relationships that are created and the meaning between those documents, and then the impact on digital ethos. So first, a quick review of key concepts will be helpful, as well as the theoretical background of the argument. The first key term, and the most important by far, is digital ethos. And in terms of this, many of the discussions, as I said, tend to refer to simplified concepts of rhetoric. In this case, credibility and character. Credibility refers to the ways in which the author establishes their credibility through the speech act, what they say and how they say it. Character is in terms of habitual virtuous behavior that is demonstrated by the speaker. In a digital environment, these might look like credibility as how the website is structured, and information is presented, and character might be established through author credentials and an established scholarly background. So ultimately, these discussions, limited to credibility and character, don't address context, and I think that that is a very great omission. Christy Fleckenstein addresses this in her article, Who's Writing? And she makes a comparison between ancient Greek rhetoric, the site of the creation of ethos, as well as current digital environments. And what she says is that they share a construction that is contextual, that involves these elements. It involves the content producer, the content consumer, the content itself, and the environment in which it's created. So my definition of ethos includes those concepts, highlights the contextual nature of it, and the ways that hypertext and intertextuality impact digital ethos. Hypertextuality is the next key term. Because it is one of the primary mechanisms for connecting texts on the internet, as well as for information retrieval, it's a productive location to begin discussions on textual relationships and rhetorical concepts. There are two key parts to this definition. One is as a technology, the other is as a textuality. So hypertext as a technology is best demonstrated in what we know as the World Wide Web, or the internet, which is a series of connected texts. And it can be any number of connected texts, widely dispersed. It can have any number of entry and exit points. And what that means is that it theoretically can extend indefinitely. The other thing that's interesting about this is that computer science theorists are the ones who originally created this theory, such as Ted Nelson and Vannevar Bush is another example. And these theories would eventually combine with the textuality theories to create the current hypertextuality. Essentially, it is a network structure that is created through the technology and connects those texts. And this is demonstrated by Nelson in his work, Literary Machines, that this text is non-sequential, it branches off, it allows the reader choice. Hypertext as a textuality, as Nelson said and demonstrated, is this kind of blocks of text that are connected together and can be read non-sequentially. And the theory behind the textuality was done by the literary theorists, such as Roland Barthes, specifically, which is an example here of what he has said. Essentially, the textuality is demonstrated through the mobility and openness of these texts, and that a reader can enter the network at any point, can explore the network through any path, and then can exit wherever they choose. And every time that they enter the network, they may have a very different experience. They may enter somewhere else, they may view different texts, and they may exit somewhere else. So what Barthes conceptualizes is that that means that there is the possibility for multiple meanings from the network, wherever they encounter it. Another element of hypertextuality is the rhetorical dimension, specifically in the degree of intention that's included within hypertext links. The author includes them because they want you to click on them. They want you to explore the document that's on the other side of the link and make connections between the texts. The reader is invited to expect a purposeful relationship between the texts that are linked, and that when they click on it, they will find additional information on the other end that either contradicts, corroborates, or informs the text that's there. Hypertextual intertextuality is the third term that is being discussed, specifically intertextuality. But I'm looking at intertextuality in a hypertextual environment. Hypertextuality and intertextuality both address networked structures of texts. Hypertextuality does so primarily from a structural perspective, and intertextuality does so primarily from a content perspective. And in this sense, you can see that, described as by Barthes, intertextuality is defined in terms of a text incorporating other elements of other texts. And here he says it's woven entirely with citations, references, echoes, cultural languages, which cut across it through and through in a vast stereophony, which means that no text exists unto itself. It is part of other texts within the network. There are three key characteristics to intertextuality which specifically impact my argument. The first is the gaps in the text that exist. This is really the first step that creates the possibility for intertextuality. The gaps occur and are indicated by information that is missing. This may be either implicit information or explicit information. It may be more subtle and more obvious. But essentially it requires that the reader take action to fill those gaps. And the way that they have to do that is to go to other texts that are indicated or implicated. As I said, these can be implicit or explicit. An implicit example might be a symbolic image that represents something else entirely that is not mentioned in the text. Or it can be explicit, like a hypertextual link that is an observable phenomenon, that a reader can clearly see that there is a gap here. The second characteristic is the relationship with the exterior text, where the reader goes to fill the gaps. And essentially, as Kristeva argues and as Bart said earlier, these texts incorporate elements from other texts, and the reader goes to those texts or accesses that information in order to make meaning. And it contributes significantly to the meaning because it depends on the reader's understanding of those exterior texts. If a reader has no understanding of those texts, the meaning that they get from the text that they're reading may be diminished, and it may be different than what the author was hoping would happen. The third characteristic is the intertext. This is essentially all of the relevant exterior texts and all of the parts of those texts that are relevant to this text kind of go into a big corpus, a collection of these fragments that provide additional meaning for the text. And a reader accesses that anytime they're trying to fill a gap in the text. This provides context for the text because it connects it to the network of text that exists around it. And as Riffeter said, this is necessary for understanding a text because you can't have a fully satisfactory understanding of the meaning of a text until you've looked at it through the lens of the intertext. And now in my data set analysis, I will demonstrate the intertextuality and the hypertextuality and that impact on the ethos. What I propose here is a heuristic that provides a step-by-step process for students to look at the ways that hypertextuality and intertextuality impacts digital ethos and the changes that you can observe. There are 4 steps to this. The first is to choose a focal text, which essentially functions as an entry point to the network. You could enter the network at any point. The focal text could theoretically be any text. Ideally, it would be one that includes hypertextual links. The second step is to map the hyperlink network. This provides students a visual of what the network looks like and the small part that the focal text plays within that network. The third step is to identify the intertextual relationships that are created by the hyperlinks. This requires that students have an understanding of both the focal text and the exterior texts and can then compare that information and make judgments about what relationships are created. The fourth step is to interpret the digital ethos based on the relationships that were established in the third step. And those have an impact on the ethos and determine what the ethos of the focal text as well as the network ultimately is. In my example of the heuristic, I've applied it in a very specific way. However, this heuristic could be adapted very easily, I think, to fit different situations and different expectations. So the first step, as I said, is to choose a focal text. And I could have chosen any text. Any text would have functioned for this. As I said, ideally it would have hypertextual links. In this case, I chose this because of its connection to Coney 2012. And because this was the first text that I read in opposition to the claims in the video, and that provided a really good background about the issue. This is an article called On Coney 2012, which was published on a pop culture website called The Daily What. It discusses the phenomenon, and it also has a very clear bias against the video and against invisible children, as is demonstrated very clearly and will be discussed later. It also includes 24 active hyperlinks, which makes it a very robust example for this heuristic. Step 2, as I said, was to create a visual of the hypertextual network, to map the sites for the students to see what the network looks like. As you can see, this is on Coney 2012, and it is only a part of a much larger network of texts. In this case, I have not used color significantly except to indicate pages that were on the same website and then to differentiate between the sites. So you can see here that all of these are connected or came from Charity Navigator. The other interesting thing about this is that On Coney 2012 links all of these sites, but these other sites link each other, which makes for a much more robust network and also demonstrates the intertextuality. The third step is to establish intertextual relationships. And the way that students do this is to, again, look at the information in the focal text, compare it against information that they find in the exterior text, and classify those relationships. I specifically identified 3: informing, corroborating, and contradicting. These will not always be the relationships that are identified through the heuristic. In this case, in the comparison between the texts, these are the actions I mostly saw happening, and so these are the relationships that I classified. A text could fall under any one of these categories, but for clarity's sake, I grouped them under the category that they best represented. This is the map recolored to demonstrate the intertextual relationships. The yellow are the informing, the red are the contradicting, and the green are the corroborating. And you can see that the green are more than the others, and then on Coney 2012 there. So the informing relationships functioned for 7 of the 24 links that were provided in the focal text. Typically these tended to be sites that made a gesture towards objectivity, like Wikipedia with its encyclopedic nature. Whether or not it actually is objective is another issue. But the intention here with these articles was not to necessarily address the claims that the focal text was making, to corroborate them or contradict them, but rather what they functioned to do was to provide background information. An example of that is the Wikipedia articles that were provided here. There were 2 of them, one on invisible children and then one on the Lord's Resistance Army, which Coney leads. And again, mainly it just functioned to provide background that was not in the focal text. The next relationship are the corroborating relationships. 11 of these links were the corroborating relationships, the majority of them as we might expect. These essentially support the claims that are made, confirm what the author is saying. An example of this is the photo of the Invisible Children founders posing with the Sudan People's Liberation Army, or the SPLA, and also with some very large weapons. The claim that is made in the focal text is that Invisible Children supports militaries in the area, and also that those militaries are accused of looting and raping. So the photo, which demonstrates evidence of a very close relationship, as well as the claims that are made in the focal text, indicates that Invisible Children is an irresponsible, possibly dangerously irresponsible organization. Another example of the intertext and the network at work is that the photo is also linked by Wikipedia. And Wikipedia provides additional information on the photograph that was not provided in the focal text. That information actually, again, corroborates the claim that is made in the focal text about Invisible Children and this photo. They provide some quotes from the photographer who took it, who disagreed with the Invisible Children philosophy. So again, Wikipedia ends up corroborating on Coney 2012, but not intentionally by the focal text. The third relationship is contradicting relationships. And these to me were the most interesting. 6 of the 24 were contradicting relationships. They actually corroborated parts of the article. In the gaps that were created in the focal text were filled and corroborated the information, but the rest of the articles actually contradicted some of the claims that were in the focal text. An example of this is the Chris Blattman blog post, Visible Children. The gap in the focal text is actually filled by this article. The gap in the focal text addresses how Invisible Children has been called misleading, naive, and dangerous by a Yale political science professor, Chris Blattman. And he does use those words in that article. But what Chris Blattman also says is, quote, "Their movie did more to bring the Lord's Resistance Army and the war in northern Uganda to US audiences, especially Congress, than any other advocacy organization on the planet. That deserves credit." So what that does is draw attention to a pretty clear bias in Onconi 2012 against Invisible Children. And it ends up contradicting some of the claims that are made in that article. Now that the intertextual relationships have been identified, the next step is to look at how those relationships actually impact the digital ethos of the focal text. And they did so in very interesting ways. The first 2, informing and corroborating, did so in ways that you might expect. The contradicting had a very interesting impact, which I will discuss in a minute. The informing relationships provided authority for the text, and they mainly did that by providing the background information. They provided actual authority in the sense that the author provided a breadth of links within the text, and vicarious authority in the sense that they provided information that the informing or that the focal text didn't provide, and then was associated with that through the network. The corroborating intertextual relationships essentially confirmed the claims that were made within the text and provided additional authority, even when they did so unintentionally, like the Wikipedia article I mentioned previously. The third relationship, the contradicting intertextual relationships, had the biggest impact on the digital ethos, and in a positive way, ironically. Especially for me as a reader of this text, I was bothered by the bias that was very clear to me. I was also bothered by the fact that the Invisible Children website wasn't linked anywhere within the focal text. What these contradicting texts did was to actually balance out those issues. By providing a more even point of view, an alternate point of view that was associated with it through the network, it served for me as a reader to balance that, the bias. And also the Invisible Children website was provided elsewhere. And it was associated with that text through the network and therefore alleviated my concerns about it. So ultimately, I viewed the ethos of the network and of the focal text as being positive because of its balanced approach. So it had an impact, a very obvious impact for this example. So what I've hoped to do through this thesis and through this heuristic is to illustrate that digital ethos does not exist within a single text, within a vacuum. It is a contextual phenomenon. And that it includes elements of the hypertextual network where it resides and the intertextual relationships between hypertextual links that help to construct it. Those relationships then provide a way to evaluate the ethos within the network and within the focal text. There are 4 implications of this argument that I think are very significant. The first is to digital and rhetorical literacies. Stuart Selber proposes that there are 3 types of literacies that go hand in hand for students, and these are functional, critical, and rhetorical literacies. This heuristic helps to achieve those literacies, functional and critical, through looking at the ways that hypertextual networks are constructed and what they are doing. And the rhetorical literacies are addressed in the ways that students begin to create texts. They do so through the map that is produced through the heuristic, as well as any analysis that they might do based on the heuristic. Also, in connection with student production of texts, students get the opportunity through the heuristic to learn about how the intertextual, hypertextual, and rhetorical elements construct ethos. They then can use that information, construct ethos and text. They can then use that information when they are constructing their own texts and consider those elements and how they can utilize them to their advantage. The third impact or implication is the rhetorical significance of this concept. Intertextual and hypertextual networks could have great impact on the ways that we look at pathos and logos and how those are connected in the network. It also could have impact on the rhetorical canons and how those are employed within the network, or creating text to put on the network. The fourth implication is that it offers an alternative strategy for analyzing ethos, for analyzing rhetorical concepts in the digital environment. And I say this because it's important to me, because I noticed that as I was going through this heuristic, I had a really hard time not focusing on the traditional techniques, not looking at who the author was of the article, what their credentials were, what type of site it was, whether it was popular or scholarly. It was difficult for me to avoid those and focus on my intention. So this demonstrated to me that these were sort of entrenched practices and that encouraging alternative strategies could be a good thing. Michael Joyce has argued, quote, "This is the trouble with hypertext at any level. It is messy. It lets you see ghosts. It is always haunted by the possibility of other voices, other topographies. If this is true of the digital environment, if it is haunted by a multiplicity of voices, by diverse spaces, then we can't ask students to pretend that there is only one voice speaking in isolation. Rather, we should encourage them to participate in these intertextual conversations, which are confusing and chaotic, but connected, and ultimately give them the chance to contribute their own voice." Thank you.